This is a reading from Akita, The Tears and Message of Mary. Thermal cure. Sister Agnes had always been of fragile health from her infancy. It was not rare that she would go several times a year for a thermal cure. Professor Okuhara now counseled this treatment for her at the thermal baths of Y. She there found a haven of warm peace of which she had so much need in order to recover from the sad trials she had had to undergo. In that isolated village in the hollow of the mountains, a place so familiar to her, she found the attentive welcome of the director of the establishment, to which was added the beneficial effect of the warm waters. Nevertheless, the absence of daily mass and of the Eucharist must have been extremely difficult to bear for a person desiring and devoting her life in prayer in a convent. Bishop Ito was able to make only 3 short visits of a day during the 3 months she was there. As for myself, I could hardly do more than bring her communion 1 or 2 times a month, covering the 170 kilometers by train or bus. I spoke to her of the Passion of our Lord, and I enjoined her to draw courage from it. She answered that she felt sustained by this meditation. When she said stripped of all her energies, she was also making reference to other events which affected her deeply. Indeed, some will say that there was not sufficient reason to be put into such a state by a single day of brainwashing. But we must remember that Sister Agnes's health was just sufficient to lead the community life of the convent at the same tempo of the others. Moreover, she had just lost her mother, and at the beginning of the same year, she had been affected by the death of her father, whom she so much loved. Now her mother left her, this mother whom she had caused so much fatigue and worry with her fragile health, her long malady, her 11 operations, and the last sacraments administered twice when she was at the point of death. The profound sorrow that she felt because of this weighed heavily on her fragile shoulders, and it was precisely in these difficult moments that they came to take her literally by force to Tokyo. Her family obviously opposed it, in order to submit to the good offices of the Inquisitor. To all this must be added the fact that she was completely deaf, something those around her had a tendency to forget. And total deafness does not seem to be simply a handicap, as one would be tempted to think. Just imagine the anguish into which a person is plunged who hears nothing. Dangers can strike from behind, impossible to avoid. She did succeed well in communicating normally thanks to lip reading and an innate intuition, but her nerves must have been perpetually strained. Hardly had she been presented to the Inquisitor, then she had to follow a sermon which didn't finish, and this in a very proper Japanese, requiring a particularly sustained attention necessary to read the lips of a stranger. The sermon consisted of showing the abuse people made of the use of ectoplasmic faculties, and for someone who finds her joy and reason for living in the service of God and of others, this brutal shock took a terrible toll of her physical and moral resistance. So now perhaps one can comprehend the state of extreme exhaustion after the fear which had actually caused her hair to stand straight on her head. Then the 3 weeks in the hospital were an uninterrupted succession of medical examinations. She had no rest whatever. When she could finally leave, she had been injured in the shock of an abrupt landing on the plane and had to be transported in a wheelchair. In brief, each day brought its share of trials, so that it is no wonder from just the brief overview that I have given above, we can understand how she wondered if she could live through it all. Happily, a convalescence at the thermal station of Y was most beneficial. When I went to see her, she let me know that she did not feel any solitude, sustained by meditation on the Passion. Furthermore, she did not have the air of being depressed. Loving person that she was, Sister Agnes very soon had bonds of friendship with the family of the establishment and the others taking the cure. She explains that her greatest pleasure was in the company of the birds of the mountain. They came one after the other to pick the crumbs of cake which she spread at the edge of the window. They ate from her hand. They rested on her arms, her shoulders, and even her head. Even the most timid birds came to see her, to the joy of all around. Furthermore, the visits of the guardian angel continued contrary to the affirmation of the Inquisitor. She will not appear more. The angel appeared often at Sister's side, encouraging her with a sweet smile and sometimes saying the rosary with her. 3 months passed in this way, and with the fresh breezes of autumn, she had sufficiently recovered her strength to return to the convent. the plans of Providence. As we have already seen, the atmosphere which awaited Sister Agnes when she returned to the convent was not at all the same as before. Her companions were troubled, not knowing what attitude to adopt now that the mysterious events which had so much overwhelmed them were relegated to the cupboard of ectoplasms. It must have been quite difficult for them to show the same attention to her now denounced by the authority as the instigatrix of the affair. For my part, I continued to speak of the events in the monthly bulletin in the community, furnishing new information connected with it. At the same time, I suggested to the community to discreetly meditate on these things with humility, as signs sent by the Lord. However, after I published the detailed account of the lacrimation of the 1st of May, Bishop Ito sent me this order. This kind of information risks provoking misunderstandings. Since a commission of inquiry has been charged to study the matter, keep silence until the conclusions are published. From that time on, I no longer spoke for a certain time, keeping myself to diverse events of the life of the convent. Nevertheless, it would happen that I would briefly recall this or that special fact. Thus, a Korean woman of advanced age had, during a stay at Yuzawadai, experienced a sweet perfume emanating from the statue, something which had not happened for a long time. She said that the events of Yuzawadai were widely known in Korea through a book entitled The Virgin Mary Weeps at Akita, already 20,000 copies sold, exhausting the edition, and that the Catholics of Korea believed in the truth of the miracle and dreamed of coming here in pilgrimage. Now the phenomena of the tears had stopped completely from the moment when the commission of inquiry was begun, and I concluded at that time that they were definitely terminated. 2 years later, this commission decided not to recognize the supernatural character of the events, but no details were given to us on the content of the study. Bishop Ito commanded that we submit to the conclusions of the commission without discussion after they were published. One of the sisters asked if it was necessary to obey even when conscience opposed. He had confirmed, in a case like this, it is important to obey. However, it would seem that Bishop Ito was very troubled by the negative conclusion of the commission, and he was not able to decide to make a public declaration on the subject. Instead, some months later, he went personally to Rome to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. There, he exposed all the facts and asked the advice of an authorized person. He was given the following advice: if you are not convinced by the conclusions of this commission, you must form another yourself and begin the study from the beginning. As we have already seen, the intimate journal of Sister Agnes had been photocopied and used by the Inquisitor as the unique piece of the dossier with the intention of denying everything, and the judgment was pronounced without any member of the said commission outside of the Inquisitor ever having put foot in the convent of Yuzawadai to verify the facts, to live the daily life of the convent, and to better know the dispositions and spirit of the members. To base such an important decision solely on the intimate journal without finding the need to come and find out for oneself is indeed a curious way of fulfilling such a grave responsibility. When the second commission was created on the initiative of the bishop, the result of the first was known by all. For my part, the more I studied what had happened, the more evident to me it was that the events were supernatural. Throughout the inquiries, the life of the convent continued without any particular change, and by little groups, pilgrims continued to come from the four corners of the country. Chapter 15, New Signs. As we have seen, we had asked the aid of Saint Joseph in order that we might complete the Garden of Mary. Having learned the request of the angel, it is sad that there is no exterior sign here in honor of Saint Joseph. Ask your superior to have an exterior sign erected in his honor when you are able, even if it is not right away. I hastened to acquire a little statue of Saint Joseph, which I had placed in such a way as to make it a counterpart to that of Mary, at the other side of the altar. Shortly afterwards, M.H., who frequented our prayer meetings, expressed a desire to offer a statue of the saint in wood, which he ordered from Mr. Saburo Wakasa, sculptor of the statue of the Virgin. The statue was delivered 6 months later. It was made in such a way as to accord very well with that of the Virgin, of the same height and from the same wood. Meanwhile, because of the inquiry, the statue of Our Lady had been removed to the corner, and so we decided to place the statue of Saint Joseph there beside that of Our Lady on the 15th of August, the solemn day we had chosen for its blessing. At the beginning of July, we were visited by 32 children from the prefecture of Wakayama, accompanied by Mr. and Mrs. Y, directors of a private school. These youths of elementary school and of college had not been baptized, and I was wondering what we could do that might leave them a good memory of the long trip that they had made to Akita. To celebrate the second anniversary of the garden and at the same time to thank St. Joseph, to whom it owed its existence, I had the idea of a procession in the garden carrying the holy patron at the head of the cortege. I spoke of this to Mr. and Mrs. Y and to the sisters, and all agreed. Such a manifestation might appear childish at first sight, but any act of faith implies a childish candor, and this one seemed to me quite proper for the young people. Thus, on the evening of the 26th of July, the day of their arrival, we processed around the garden several times, the boys at the head with the statue of St. Joseph on their shoulders, as though preparing for the blessing which was to take place some days later. The adults followed with candles, singing hymns between decades of the Rosary. It was a very beautiful procession. After the procession, which lasted about an hour, we brought the statue of St. Joseph back into the room to be placed next to the statue of Mary. And hardly had the sacristy sister put on the light than she exclaimed, "The statue of the Virgin weeps again." At first I thought she was joking, but she signaled for me to come while I was still at the doorway. It was true. Streams of completely fresh tears were visible from the chin down to the neck piece. Evidently, it was a question of the very same phenomenon of weeping which had stopped 2 years earlier, and which had been repeated 10 times. At the announcement of the news, more than 50 persons, including the children, gathered in the little room. Among them were Mr. and Mrs. H., donors of the statue of St. Joseph. They had come especially that day to participate in the candlelight procession. By the end of the second decade of the Rosary, the tears were completely dried. For the children, it was a memorable pilgrimage in the distant region of Michinoku, in the midst of the candles, the song, and the prayers, and they carried in their hearts the candid joy of being the Knights of St. Joseph. They had contemplated the tears with astonishment. For them, Mary expressed her joy in seeing them gathered about her. They were full of warmth and happiness when it came time to leave. Without doubt, Mr. H. also saw the tears of Mary, a sign of thanksgiving for the donation of St. Joseph. Unfortunately, it was not possible to ask his impressions because he died suddenly the following day. His spouse relates that during a game of golf, he had been suddenly surprised by a violent pain in his neck. He soon succumbed to a heart attack. The evening before, they were going to return by car. After the festivities in the Garden of Mary, he had proposed to his wife to come to pray at Yuzawadai every day. Greatly absorbed in his work as an inventor, he had never shown very fervent faith. He was baptized before he died, and he must have been profoundly impressed by the tears of Mary to have taken such a resolution. His wife had the consolation of seeing him called to God in excellent disposition of soul. Having announced that the lacrimations would not last a long time, the inquisitor found it perfectly normal that they had not recurred in 2 years after the inquiry had begun. This is what he had affirmed to me when I visited him in person, to know exactly his point of view and his arguments. According to him, his theological investigations had revealed that the sister had voluntarily provoked the 10th lacrimation just before the beginning of the inquiry in order to influence the judgment. Nevertheless, Our Lady, through the statue, had, as it were, guarded silence for 2 years, and 2 months relegated to an antechamber, and now began to weep absolutely, as if she had waited until the unfavorable decision of the commission was known. It was the evening of the 26th of July, 1978, and after that the phenomenon would be repeated many times until the feast of Our Lady of the Seven Sorrows. Translator's note. Father Yasuda refers to his own suffering during these terrible 2 years in just one sentence, saying that there were times that he felt so low that he was tempted to give it all up, and he hardly spoke at much greater length about the terrible sufferings of Sister Agnes, which were so great that she wondered if she could possibly live through them. And what about the sufferings of the entire community? There was so much in that question put to the bishop by just one of the sisters, And if it is against our conscience, are we not to believe? And while the tears of Our Lady had always aroused great compassion and sorrow in them, causing them to weep, now, after 2 years and 2 months, the tears of Our Lady this time seemed like tears of joy. Father Yasuda remarks that the young children who witnessed this left with a feeling of warmth and happiness, undoubtedly reflecting his own joy after such a long, almost interminable period of trial. Indeed, a trial which he thought he would not end because he had never expected that the statue would weep again, after 2 years of nothing but contradiction and crosses. And now a new inquiry had been set up by the bishop, which would certainly be influenced by the one conducted by the inquisitor, who had stated flatly that the last lacrimation was deliberately brought on by Sister Agnes, and that there would be no more. But Bishop Ito had gone to Rome for advice, and on that advice he had established a new inquiry. And at this dramatic moment, Our Lady intervened by renewing the miracle. From the beginning of the phenomenon of the tears on the 4th of January, 1975, until the Feast of Our Lady of Sorrows on the 15th of September, 1981, the statue has cried 101 times. A little later, Bishop Ito had gone to the inquisitor to ask him what explanation he would give to the fact that the statue wept even when Sister Agnes was far from the convent. He obtained an answer which, to say the least, is surprising. It is because another sister near the statue also possesses ectoplasmic faculties. I spoke above of the reaction of MH and his wife and of the children. For my part, it was with renewed emotion that I saw the phenomenon of lacrimation again, over and against the wisdom of humans who obstinately deny. God continues his work in sovereign liberty. At least, this is what I had felt in my interior conscience. And in fact, as to fill the void of those 2 years and 2 months, the statue of Our Lady now began to weep when she wished, as she wished. The thesis of tears caused by ectoplasm, accentuated by the announcement of the inquisitor that these mysterious events would soon cease, fell apart like a house of cards. The value of a simple faith was taught to us here once again. One feels the necessity of reviving in our contemporary world, without seeking to minimize its sense, the teaching of Jesus. If you have a faith as great as a mustard seed, you will say to that mountain to throw itself into the sea, and it will throw itself into the sea. Each time that I saw the brown cheeks of the statue become wet as those of a living person, I could not fail to invoke Mary at the foot of the cross by her agonizing Son. More than any other artistic representation of the Passion, no matter how beautiful and well made, the sight of true human tears coming forth from a simple wooden statue has something so poignant that it touches directly to the heart. Nature is so made that even the most marked events, even those one should never forget, do not resist the usage of time. Impressions tarnish and memories fade. In this regard, it seems to me that the tears of Our Lady are also a grace given to our time in order to revive us in the reminder of Christ suspended on the cross, and of the sorrowful participation of Mary in his divine sacrifice.